Alright, so let's move on to the French Revolution and the Republic. So, there were several causes of the French Revolution. One of them was resentments against the monarchy and structure of society. Society was based on pretty much three distinct groups and then the king. So the old order, what they call the old order, was the social political structure which created a lot of the problems that we're going to discuss today and that caused the French Revolution. So the king, like I said, was at the top of the old order, and there were three social groups which were called estates under him. So the king at the time of the revolution was Louis XVI. He was shy and indecisive. He wasn't a great ruler, but in contrast, his wife Marie Antoinette knew what she wanted out of life, which was basically material goods, and she would pay any price to get it. So lavish spending and spoiled, head not with the people type of government is what Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were. So the first estate was the Roman Catholic clergy, and this was only 1% of the population. They didn't have to answer to the same laws as everyone else did, and they didn't have to pay taxes. So they were already pretty resented by those who did have to pay taxes. The second estate was the nobility, and this was less than 2% of the population. They controlled a lot of the wealth in France, but they didn't pay much in taxes. And they forced peasants to work on their land pretty much for free, but also pay taxes to them. And eventually, the third estate, which is the next one, they're the vast majority of the population. So 97% of the population of Europe is of France is in the third estate. And the third estate itself was made up of several groups. So at the top you have the bourgeoisie, which were city-dwelling merchants and professionals like lawyers and like doctors and stuff. And so they were at the top of the third estate. And then artisans and workers, who were called sans-culottes, which just basically means without breeches. So they wore a different type of clothing than the bourgeoisie and the rest of the estates. And then the bottom of the third estate was the peasants, who, and the third estate paid the most taxes and pretty much supported the French government by itself. Okay, so Enlightenment ideas are another thing that led to the French Revolution. So people were inspired by what had transpired in the American colonies. So the revolution that had happened there, they wondered if they couldn't try to employ some of the same tactics and change things in their own country. A third cause of the revolution was financial crisis. So France was deeply in debt because the king and his court continued to spend lavishly when they really couldn't afford to. As kind of a last resort, Louis XVI tried to tax the second estate, but because his rule was so weak, they just refused to pay, and Louis backed down, like he wasn't a king. And this eventually led to bankruptcy for France. And to make matters worse, nature was creating more economic problems. So a hailstorm and drought ruined the harvest. And then the winter that year, in 1788, was the worst that France had seen in almost 100 years. The rivers froze up, which didn't allow water mills to grind wheat into flour, which means that France didn't get the amount of bread it needed. And bread was pretty much a third of people's diets, maybe even more than that on some days. And if they didn't have bread, it meant that food was scarce. Firewood was scarce as well because people were freezing, and they were hungry and scared. But even though France was experiencing this time of heartache, the first and second estates still refused to pay taxes. So they tried to reform a little bit. So the nobility pressured Louis to call a meeting of the Estates General, and the Estates General was just an assembly made up of 3 estates. They actually wanted to approve new taxes on the third estate. It was supposed to be the issue of this meeting. But this was kind of the first meeting for everyone involved, because the Estates General hadn't met for 175 years. So in the year leading up to the meeting, people began to document all their grievances in notebooks. So when people, and their notebooks, which were called cahiers, they were called cahiers, when they arrived in Paris in 1789, it was clear that a lot of people were expecting sweeping reforms. So this is how the voting worked in the Estates General. Each estate had 1 vote in the assembly. And traditionally, the first and second estates voted together, which meant that the third estate was outvoted. But this time, third estate members were inspired by Enlightenment ideas, and they wanted to change the voting process. So at the start of the first meeting, King Louis ordered the assembly to follow the old rules of voting. Each estate gets 1 vote. But the third estate refused, because they had more representatives than the first or second, and they believed that if each representative had 1 vote, that would be the most fair way to do it. When Louis refused to let them vote like that, they proclaimed themselves a legislature, and they called it the National Assembly, and they said that they had the right to make laws for France. So Louis' reaction to that was to basically lock them out of where they were meeting, but they continued to meet on a vacant tennis court. And this is where they swore the tennis court oath, which just said that they would not leave the court until they had written a constitution for France. Eventually, Louis relented and allowed each representative to have a vote. But the works of a constitution was still there.